Well, thank you very much for three really fascinating presentations, which, really, I think they were wonderful because, particularly as at the start of this conference, providing an overview, an example of a very specific targeted effort, and then really very interesting insights from these historical cases. So we have about 20 minutes for questions and discussion involving the floor. So yes, so we have 2 microphones here, so please line up, and please will you make sure to introduce yourself before you speak. So I turn to you first, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Joanna Meyer. I have two points. I'm interested in lots of things, but the BDS movement and U.S.'s relationship with Israel, especially the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. They have what's called UCB, U.S.-Israel Business Initiative. I've been to 2 meetings of theirs because I'm interested in water security and the BDS movement. And there were several measures passed in Washington to even strengthen the business alliance, allowing more business between the U.S. and Israel. And I'm trying to remember what the other thing was. Anyway, the U.S. doesn't really want to let go of our regional relationship. And also, Israel has a lot of cyber technology that we want to have access to. So I'm interested in if there's this BDS movement, but the U.S. is going full speed to continue the relationship with Israel, what does that look like? If we have small divestments, how does that compare with a body like the U.S.? The second point is, I'm interested.
We need to be rapid, please.
Okay, I'll be very quick. Second point is, I'm interested in water ethics. I'm wondering if the companies that use the most water, coal industries, if they will start to make changes in their use of water and to improve the climate situation once the businesses are touched by the climate, and at one point will that happen? Thank you.
Okay, so I think we can take a few questions and have responses grouped. So yes. Yes. Right. Yeah. So anyway.
Oh.
All right, I guess we're all asking questions. My name is Adam Carolyn with Burma Task Force USA. So one thing just to mention is that we think it would be a bit early to count Burma as a success, given the persecution and the scale of persecution of the Rohingya, and also the very recent decision to take 1 million people off the voting rolls, and the political games around the upcoming election, including the UN-sponsored national census. There's a lot of problems in Burma, including massive land confiscations. So I think it's a bit early. However, I'd be interested to know about Professor Mr. Neier's ideas about ways to engage, but also to selectively use the leverage of sanctions as we move forward. And also, it's a complicated situation. I did also want to ask less about Burma, but in general, the relationship between black market response to sanctions and also corruption and sanctions. It's probably problematical, and it may relate to other speakers as well.
Okay.
My name is Marion Lipschutz. I'm a member of both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I'm passionate about human rights issues, and in that context, I wanted to ask about Saudi Arabia because I definitely think it's valid to consider Saudi Arabia as a gender apartheid state. In addition, increased attention has been focused on human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia because of the case of Raif Badawi and the flogging. I am not naive. I realize that in the post 9/11 environment, our relationship with Saudi Arabia is complex. Nevertheless, I'm interested in what people on this panel think can be done, if anything can be done, to change the horrendous human rights situation in that country.
Yes, and then this gentleman. I think we'll take these four and then see.
Glad to see these are nice, easy questions.
So, here.
This is partly a comment as well as a question. My name is Richard Knight. I worked at the American Committee in Africa and its associate, the Africa Fund, from early 1975 past the end of apartheid. So I'm very familiar with the whole divestment and sanctions campaign. And I think the thing about South Africa has many things that are different about that situation than others. First of all, the call for sanctions came from inside South Africa. It came from the African National Congress, right? And it was basically turned into divestment by activists in this country. You know, you want sanctions? Okay, divest, get out of South Africa. And the other thing is, the second thing is, especially after 1976, there was a very big movement inside South Africa, which we were supporting. I mean, I don't think you have that in countries like China. So I think that that's an important difference. And maybe some of the other cases where people question whether it failed, people could comment on that. And of course, there were a lot of South Africans in this country who went around and were part of that campaign. So I think, and it's also important that the 1986 Act was great. It was important that it passed. But almost everything in the Act we'd already achieved. Through the bank campaign, we essentially got all the banks to stop making loans to South Africa, and when Chase followed suit, South Africa had declared debt standstill, and there was never any more loans to South Africa. Companies were pulling out, not investing in South Africa by that time. So I think that South Africa is, and that was more from the divestment campaigns than from official federal sanctions. So I think that South Africa is more of a divestment campaign than a sanctions campaign, and I don't know how that fits in with fossil fuels or anything else. But I think that South Africa has many aspects about it which is very different from the other cases. I don't know if that's quite a question, but it's...
Well, we will also have a session on South Africa immediately following this one, so in about half an hour's time. You will be able to engage again, this time with Justice Goldstone, who is very deeply into this. So I just take this group of questions and ask for responses, and hopefully we will have another round. So obviously there's no need for each one of you to respond to each one of the questions, and some of these questions may not actually find an answer amongst, I think some of these are comments. So I'll just go in the reverse order. Perhaps, Aryeh, you could start with any comments you'd like to offer.
First, as far as the boycott and divestment campaign with respect to Israel is concerned, I haven't taken a position on that, and I don't propose to do so I haven't taken a position on the boycott and divestment campaign with respect to Israel, and I don't propose to do so at this point. But I do think that the campaign is valuable to the extent that it spurs debate with respect to Israeli human rights practices. I also think that it's important in a campaign which involves sanctions to be able to show an even-handed approach to human rights. And I worry that some of those who are engaged in that campaign are apologists for abuses that are committed by Hamas, say in the Gaza territory, and that my own comfort in associating with any campaign would be much greater if I thought that those who were promoting this campaign were even-handedly concerned with abuses of human rights. I'm not willing to associate with a campaign where I don't think that is the case. And Hamas is guilty of very severe abuses of human rights in the territory that it controls. So far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, I think Saudi Arabia is somewhat in the position of China. That is, it has the economic power against others, and it's not as though others have the economic power to use economic sanctions against Saudi Arabia as a way of trying to promote human rights. I do think that greater concern with human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia is appropriate. I think the United States and other governments are to be criticized for their silence about severe abuses of human rights in Saudi Arabia, but I don't think the method by which one can promote human rights in Saudi Arabia is by threatening economic sanctions. I think, if anything, the effect would be counterproductive if it took the form of an effort against an economic effort against Saudi Arabia. So far as South Africa is concerned, again, my view is that whatever the economic impact of the divestment campaign and the sanctions effort was concerned, ought not to be regarded as the most important matter. I think the most important matter was stigmatizing South Africa as a pariah on the basis of the apartheid system and the legion of human rights abuses that accompanied the apartheid system. And I think that creating the impression that South Africa was a pariah internationally ultimately had the most significant impact in bringing about change.
Dan, do you want to address any of these questions? Maybe
sure,
the one on water ethics, or?
Sure, these are really easy questions. I think I can tackle those. Just to add on what Aryeh said, in terms of the BDS, actually what I was struck by listening to Reid is the sort of questions about the ways in which state-imposed sanctions and divestment campaigns, the ways in which they're similar and the ways in which they're different. And I think the one way in which they're primarily similar is that the notion of economic coercion is far more potent at the threat stage than it is at the implementation stage. And so I think that applies to BDS as well as anything else, which is if you actually start seeing, the more you actually really do begin to see things like divestment, I actually think the chance for any kind of dialogue starts to break down. And Israel will simply find alternative ways of coping. Although it's possible consumer boycotts would have more of an effect in that respect. But again, it's a question of whether or not you'd actually get widespread buy-in. And in the case of the United States, you're not going to get widespread buy-in because that's, it's not a coincidence that the first free trade agreement the United States signed was with Israel. There are going to be hard strictures on what the U.S. government is going to impose. And one of the findings, I would say, in terms of my own research, is that while sanctioning allies tends to have a far better track record of success, not surprisingly, the sender country is far more reluctant to sanction its own ally for unsurprising reasons. And so as a result, that's not going to happen in the case of the United States. I have absolutely nothing to say about the water because I have no idea what I could say about it. And Aryeh said all the other smart things that I would have wanted to, so I'll defer.
Reid.
As I joked earlier, I get confused between BDS and BDSM, so I'm not going to hazard a comment on these topics. I think that my two colleagues spoke very knowledgeably about both of them.
Okay, we have time for just, I think there are 3, so please keep your questions, comments very short. We have very little time. Yes.
Okay.
Please.
You can hear me? Okay. I'm a CUNY student, and I'm a part of a group called CUNY Divest. So my question is directed to Mr. Capalino.
Can you speak louder?
You can hear me?
And give your name,
Louder.
please.
Okay. There we go. My question is directed to Mr. Capalino. I'm a CUNY student, and I'm a part of CUNY Divest. So some of the behaviors that you discussed that, members such as myself or organizers such as myself would like to see fossil fuel companies kind of curb are the lobbying for subsidies or to keep, I think you said 80% of the reserves in the ground and whatnot. I'm kind of curious how maybe you could give examples of successful times where engagement was better than, say, going the divestment route, because those type of behaviors on the part of fossil fuel companies, as I understand it, seem almost kind of fundamental to what they have become. So it seems almost, it seems very difficult to ask them to kind of be the complete opposite of, what they are. So I'm just curious, how do you dialogue when you have such a fundamental opposition to such an industry?
Thank you. Let's go get the other. Yes,
Yeah.
please. Yes.
Is this on? Yes, thank you. Tom Cruiser from Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Hey, Reid. Couple of challenges to that. I think the previous question, pointed to it, but my sense is that the frame is wrong. Climate change is arguably, the largest market failure that we've seen in human history. That's Lord Stern's formulation, where, you can dump all this gunk into the air. These companies do this and pay no tax. The failure of a price on carbon, which in turn is a governance failure. So this is, in fact, an economic step addressing a financial sector as a way to get to a governance solution, which is create the surround sound, create the political conditions so that governments and governance might act to actually put a price on carbon or take other measures against climate change. Therefore, to try and draw a direct connection between divestment and specific CapEx programs is a little bit disingenuous, because no one, I think, in the divestment movement is saying that that's going to be a direct cause and effect. Rather, it's going to create, as in the case of South Africa, a larger process, and it's going to draw attention, it's going to demand transparencies, accountabilities, and create the political conditions so that political actors might act. So I think to evaluate it the other way is probably unfair. That's number one. And number two, yes, I'd just like to echo, all right, if the argument is you lose the opportunity to engage by selling stocks, when has engagement on this actually mattered? When can you give us one or two specific instances where shareholder engagement has actually stopped capital expenditures in the exploitation of new fossil fuel fields?
Right. So,
No, we have the final. This is the final question.
And my questions may be very similar to the last two, but it would probably be quicker if I just went through them and, rather than try to change them, in order to cut out what these people have already asked. My name's Lynn Harrington, and I have been active with 350 New York City, and I have been sort of discouraged by how by the really lack of success and looking into shareholder engagement, actually, and I found that it's very hard to find out much about it, really. So it's not marketed at all. All of the information out there is really from the divestment movement. And so my questions are, Could you explain again a little
Can
more?
you speak into the
Oh,
mic?
explain a little, a little more. And I think she also asked it about what Stringer is doing with his boardroom accountability movement, and how, I can't read my own handwriting, determined to, if one were to become more active as a shareholder engager, could buy some, amount of stock, what would one actually do? Are there groups similar to 350 New York City a person could, join? What is it that they can accomplish? What part of divestment is actually working, i.e. is the divestment of coal? I read the Exxon papers, and they actually are expecting coal to go down. And what can a climate competent board member do? And when we talk of the now, is there any talk of these energy industries actually investing in clean energy solutions, putting some of that big money they have into becoming more wide energy companies?
Thank you very much. So I think these questions are essentially for you, Reid.
I was going to let my colleagues, handle these. No, jump in. So all very good questions. So take a few of them in order. I'll begin with Tom's questions. And Tom, I agree with you in much of the framing. And I had if you were able to hear the presentation, did have a slide where it talked about, moral, economic, political divestments, an economic act. But yes, I agree with you in that it's a moral and political campaign, intended to build pressure on companies and build political momentum for solutions. And it's certainly not a joke, not a coincidence that many of the leaders of the fossil-free movement, 350.org and others, sort of cut their teeth regarding climate, trying to organize around cap and trade and other congressional solutions. So I should have brought today, I have my T-shirts from the 2007 Step It Up campaign, which was intended to step up pressure on Congress in order to enact comprehensive climate and energy legislation. So yes, I agree with you in the regard that the movement has chiefly, I think, moral and political aims. That said, it is targeted at investors who, by definition, have a sort of economic financial way of looking at the world. So I think the economic financial parts of it need to be. Pardon me. I think. Did you hear? Okay. So I think the economic and political parts of it need to be addressed as well. Did you get most of that answer? You did not. Okay. So yes, I agree with Tom. Chiefly economic and political movement. No mistake, organizers of the fossil-free campaign previously organized around trying to get congressional legislation on climate. Agree with much of that. That said, it is asking for an economic act, and its target audience, institutional investors, have an economic and financial lens on the world. So I think that aspect of it does need to be paid attention to as well. That said, I'll agree that drawing on one of Aryeh's points, I think one of the interesting aspects of the divestment campaign, and I really can't speak to this given that I don't work for a fossil fuel company, but I'd be interested, to hear from inside companies about the potential stigma effect. As I've heard South Africans put it to me, I can't document this as the definitive view, but South Africans who lived through apartheid and many of whom were pro-government during that period, they said, we changed over when we saw that all of our young people were going to leave. And just we saw the future of our country going out the door. And nobody wants to think they work for a company that is being accused of destroying the planet. And I would be curious what effect this has on recruiting or morale within fossil fuel companies. So that's that aspect of the question. Let's now talk about divestment versus engagement. Remembering that what I hope to be one of my key points is that these are not sides of a coin. They are a spectrum, and there is a role investors in many cases can pursue both options. So I think there were really two questions raised about engagement. First of all, I will agree with the comment that the young woman here made and Tom echoed. It's challenging to engage with fossil fuel companies to get them to spend less on developing fossil fuels. The responses range. The polite response can be essentially what the tobacco companies said and still say, when industries approach them about tobacco, they say basically, look, we grow and sell tobacco. So if you don't like tobacco, you are under no obligation to own us. But don't become an owner of our company and then tell us not to grow and sell tobacco, because that's what we do. Okay, so it's challenging. The less polite response, one of my colleagues was once told by a large American independent, at the beginning of the conversation, the guy just said, seems to me you want to send us back to the time when we were all living in caves and eating frogs. When that, my geology textbook, I don't know when we were eating frogs exactly, but nonetheless, you get my point. So it's challenging. I'm going to talk now too about engagement generally, and then engagement on this particular question. Engagement generally, I think there have been many successes in engagement generally. Chiefly, I think around disclosure. I mean, I'm getting more, and Carbon Tracker has talked about this, but Shell and BP are both in the process of providing much more information about their projects, about their future price assumptions. It's valuable to investors. I would say also there have been disclosure successes around particular elements of a business practice. So a hot topic in 2014 for shareholder climate resolutions dealt with fugitive methane emissions and with companies agreeing to really adopt best practices when they're going to frack wells to make sure that the well is properly encased in concrete, we can reduce fugitive methane emissions. I think it's fair to say, no, there have not been successes really persuading the fossil fuel industry to invest less in capital expenditures and try to return more capital to shareholders, partly because the effort is very recent. I mean, these two shareholder resolutions I mentioned at Exxon and Chevron are two of the first efforts in order to do that. It's a tough sell. I think that I am somewhat optimistic. I think there's a role, it can potentially succeed because you're not, for many companies, it's not you're saying you have to cease to exist. You just have to do less of what you're doing. And there are precedents, for example, in the mining industry in the 80s and 90s when many companies were confronted with structural declines for their commodities, being willing to say, okay, look, we're going to shrink to grow. We're going to cut our capital expenditure budgets, return more cash to shareholders. And that's what they did. So there is precedent for companies recognizing a limited future and changing their business models. With respect to energy company investment in low carbon fuels, this is something that, again, it can be challenging. Companies have taken steps in this regard, particularly in Europe. Statoil has major investments in offshore wind and a very active energy practice group. ExxonMobil has made investments, as have others, in biofuels. It's something that I think needs to happen more and should happen more. It can be challenging just because you need to find low carbon investments that really link up with your business model. Like biofuels are a good fit because it's a fuel for transport, which they already do. It can be challenging in companies because they're so used to investing in this existing technologies that have often very high returns. They have a track record, and to come in and say, oh, you got to put in this new stuff, which is riskier, it can be a tough sell, but I think it should happen. Lastly, climate competent board, I would urge you we can talk afterward or look at the 50-50 climate project. There's a whole range of things that companies would do. I think most critical to this conversation is that they would be open to this idea of returning more capital to shareholders and investing less in high cost projects, the shrink to grow strategy. Then the question of what, as an individual, it's a good question. As an individual investor for shareholder engagement, it's challenging. This is mostly done by pension funds, by endowments, et cetera. But there needs to be, frankly, I think that's a sort of gap in the market. There should be more individual investors via whatever funds they're invested in. There should be a better mechanism of aggregating those of us who care about climate to make our voices heard. But I think it's fair to say there is definitely room to improve on that front.
Thank you very much. So we have gone over time, and so I'd like you to join me in thanking Aryeh Neier, Daniel Drezner, and Reid Capalino for this wonderful session.